I'm of the generation where I was just listening to that presentation and then I'm looking at my own and I was thinking, in my generation, we'd now put on some Leonard Cohen records and we have a red wine, sort of open a vein, really. But that's where I am. I want to argue that there's a paradigm shift going on here, and contracts aren't going to be the answer for some of it. The answer for some of it is it's gone. When I was a little boy, my aunt was a leader of Nottingham City Council in the days when it was a unitary, before it won, and then it is again. And from that council, I got my university grant. There's a whole department that used to do that, and it was next to the borough architect and not far away from the city engineer. Where are they? They aren't there now. There isn't even a department. I'm reliably informed. My son's 17, but when I went to the council, they told me they don't do grants anymore. Apparently, it's all different. And what I'm saying, in one generation, is things can just disappear, and that's what's going to happen. And anybody who thinks, let's get our heads down, make a few cuts, and then it'll all come back to all get better again, has just lost the plot. That's the permanent hit to the public finances. We've been talking about that a little bit. And that's where we are. Now, there's a very interesting fact in that the amount of fiscal tightening is greater than the hit according to the Treasury. Why? And Mr. Cameron said in a speech in Birmingham, he was asked the question, once you balance the books, will it go back to how it was? And he said, no, I don't think so. It's not what I intend. This is about a tightening down of the public sector and what the public sector does on the grounds that there is a view held in the coalition that it is overblown and part of the problem, not part of the solution. The overall post-crisis tax and benefit reforms, we talked a little bit about that. They're regressive, but oddly enough, anybody in the richest 2% of working individuals will be making a contribution. We're going to see the tightest sustained squeeze to public spending since April 1976. And as we've said, total departmental expenditure limits cut by 11% in real terms. The largest cuts to, you guessed it, communities and local government. When it says NHS and schools relatively protected, well, yes, that's true, but it's in cash terms. And the demands on the NHS in particular aren't going to be easy to manage, in my view. Now, between the budget and the comprehensive spending review, things changed. And that wasn't a long time. But if you look at the cut to current spending, to spending in total, it goes from 50 billion to 80 billion. And I'm not going to tell you it's not going to happen again, because according to the government's own watchdogs, this fiscal tightening has only got a 60% chance of working. Because it's the old problem, isn't it, that if you take a worker in Tower Hamlets on £24,000 a year and they live in social housing and have 2 children, the taxpayer costs them more if they're made redundant by Tower Hamlets Council than if they paid their 24,000. It just comes out of different pots. And so, given this, it's gone from 50 to 80 in 6 months, it could get worse if the figures don't add up. What we know is tax revenues were depressed and public spending went up. Tax revenues were down because of lower financial sector profits, lower house and equity prices. We also know that public spending is going up for a number of perverse reasons. The elderly time bomb isn't as time bomb in some ways, but what we discover now is there's far more elderly people accessing care through the local authority. Why? Well, it's 2 reasons. One, because, of course, we're living longer. But secondly, because some people's pension pots have been destroyed, so now they can access free care, which they couldn't do before. Those of you who've ever worked in an education department know more or less how you plan education departments. You see, you look at the number of people that are born, you multiply that by the infant mortality rate, you look at your migration patterns, and that's how many school places you're going to need. What we didn't know was last year, a load of 14-year-olds appeared in our schools. We didn't know that. Where do they come from? They will come from the private sector, and their parents can't afford to send them there anymore. So we have got migration from the private sector, it's just expensive. So the problems are that the demand is going up. It always does in recession. And the revenues are going down. As the rationale, perhaps, for cutting expenditure is on that slide, as a share of national income increase in spending is greater than the fall in revenues. And that was demonstrated in the slide you saw earlier. So, total spending on public service to be cut in real terms actually for 6 years, according to where we are. Now, since World War II, we've only managed 2 years. So one must assume that somewhere in the Treasury there is a fair amount of magic dust that they can sprinkle on us all and make it all work. Because if all that needs to happen is that they get it wrong and the benefits bill starts to go up. Because yes, you can cut welfare benefits. I can cut his benefit by a tenner. But if these three then go on benefit, I'm no better off. The benefit problem is still with me. Central government spending to be cut as a share of national income back to late 1990s levels. In real terms, 11.2% lower. 2 winners. International aid. It's very tiny, but it is a winner. And climate change. So those of you who are in business to sell wind farms in Malawi, this is a good time. Those of you who are forced to try and support the population of the United Kingdom, oh no, this is not very good. It's the tightest settlement for the NHS, as I said. I mean, it is protected, but it's still the tightest settlement since the 1950s. Who are the losers? Home Office, Justice, local government, business, blah, 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 blah. And obviously, the loss of budget for business innovations and skills comes from the changes in higher education spending. The biggest volunteer for cuts was good old DCLG. It is a very bad time to be in social housing. We have never seen levels of withdrawing support such as this. Here's those winners, and here's the average. And there, good old CLG, they volunteered. There's the local government one, minus 26.8%, and front-loaded, unlike everybody else's. That for some local authorities, they're looking at 10 to 15% in year 1, and then a lot less later. That's not true in any other government department. The logic, apparently, was that central government departments have a larger turning circle, and that local government's quite good at doing this. So we'll volunteer for it, was the line. CLG Communities budget, well, that's the biggest cut, as you can see, by a hell of a long way, and that's mostly housing. That's social housing. So as I say to people in the business community, if you're in the supply chain for social housing, get out. And ideally into wind farms in Malawi, but if you can't do that, just do something else. Okay, the total spending tightest since World War II, spending on public services tightest since April 1975 to March 1980, and the NHS tightest since April 1951 to March 1956. So, what's it like in local government? Well, we've got that. We've got a council tax freeze. It says time limited, but it's not. The idea is in the localism bill, they will abolish capping as being cruel and unusual punishment, and introduce a system where if you want to increase taxes, you have to have a referendum, and there will be a target figure. You must reflect on how often people have voted for higher taxes for the same services, how often you would. Did you vote for your pay rise? No, no. Yeah, I did actually. Yeah, you know. It actually does happen in the States. There are people who have voted for increased taxation, but it's always for new and specific projects, like a new bridge or a new something. It isn't to keep the same old, same old. There are some capital changes, but I was with a group of local authorities who have the money for a major capital programme. Basically, it was a programme to introduce new street lighting, which would be much lower, brighter, but more energy efficient. Payback time about 15 years. They've got the money, but they're not going to do it. And they're not going to do it because they haven't got revenue and they're having to make workers unemployed, and they just can't stomach the idea of changing all the street lights while 600 people are losing their jobs. And I can fully understand that. We also, the bit that you didn't add in is, I think, a pay freeze for in perpetuity, as far as the current generation. And if inflation takes off as well, you therefore get a workforce being demoralised as a result of that.